A sudden contact. A sharp, rising tone cuts through the static, sonar echoes bouncing off something moving fast below. Possible contact, bearing 075. The voice cracks over the intercom, and within seconds the Wisconsin comes alive. Alarm bells, men rush to stations. Engines rumble deep in her steel heart. Far below, unseen, the ocean conceals its hunter, a German-type IXC U-boat. Its periscope breaks the surface for a heartbeat, capturing the monstrous outline of the American battleship above. The commander watches through the lens, calm, precise. He knows this could be his moment to strike a blow against a symbol of American might. Torpedo tubes flood, depth calculations align, the order is given. 4 silver shapes launch into the black, leaving trails of bubbles as they race toward their target. On Wisconsin's bridge, eyes lock on the radar. The sonar ping accelerates faster, louder. The ship begins to turn hard to port, her massive hull groaning. The battle between hunter and fortress has begun. And in that instant, the Atlantic holds its breath. For years before the USS Wisconsin ever cut through the Atlantic, the ocean had been a graveyard. From the first days of World War II, German submarines, the infamous U-boats, had turned the Atlantic Ocean into a hunting ground. It was a war fought in silence and shadows. Merchant convoys vanished without a trace. Entire fleets burned beneath the waves. Between 1939 and 1943, over 2,700 Allied ships were sent to the bottom by these silent predators. The German Kriegsmarine called it the Tonnage War. Its purpose was brutally simple: starve Britain into surrender by severing her lifeline of supplies. U-boats lurked off the American coast, in the mid-Atlantic gap, and even within sight of British shores. Each night, the ocean glowed with burning oil as tankers and cargo vessels were struck by torpedoes. The ocean floor became littered with wrecks and bodies, the result of a war that most never saw, but every sailor feared. By 1942, the Allied situation was desperate. Convoys were sailing under constant threat, and the technology to detect submarines was still primitive. Early sonar, known as ASDIC, gave only a faint sense of what lay below. Radar was limited by weather and range. The hunters had the advantage of stealth, and the Allies were learning through loss. Then came the counterattack. Slowly, methodically, Allied naval engineers and tacticians reshaped the Atlantic War. Escort carriers began to patrol the convoy routes. Depth charges became deadlier. Radar detection improved, and high-frequency direction-finding stations, Huff-Duff, could pinpoint U-boat transmissions across the ocean. The tables began to turn. By 1943, wolf packs that once struck with impunity were being hunted themselves. Aircraft from escort carriers swooped low over periscopes, destroyers dropped depth charges in spreading patterns, and the once invincible U-boat arm began to crumble. German Admiral Karl Dönitz admitted grimly that his submariners were being massacred. But even as the tide turned, the cost remained staggering. Over 30,000 U-boat crewmen, nearly 3/4 of Germany's total force, would never return home. The Atlantic had consumed both hunter and hunted alike. And into this unforgiving sea, a new kind of warship was born, one that embodied speed, armor, and overwhelming firepower. The USS Wisconsin, BB-64, was commissioned on April 16, 1944, at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. She was the second to last of the mighty Iowa-class battleships, a design that represented the pinnacle of American naval engineering. With a displacement of 45,000 tons, she was both a fortress and a spear. Her sleek hull could reach 33 knots, faster than any battleship before her. Her 9/16-inch 50-caliber Mark 7 guns could hurl 2,700-pound shells over 20 miles. But beyond the raw numbers was a symbol, a declaration that the United States would not be outmatched on any ocean. The Wisconsin was built for the age of the carrier, yet she carried the spirit of old naval dominance. She was designed to escort fast carrier task forces, shield them from surface and air attack, and deliver devastating bombardment when needed. Her radar systems were cutting-edge. Her anti-aircraft batteries bristled with more than 80 guns, including 5-inch dual-purpose mounts, 14 Bofors, and 20 Oerlikons. Her crew, nearly 2,800 men, came from every corner of America. Young, untested, and proud, they trained relentlessly through the spring and summer of 1944. The Pacific awaited her, but before she could join the offensive across Asia, Wisconsin had to prove herself in the Atlantic, where the ghosts of the U-boat war still lingered. Every drill, every radar test, every anti-submarine exercise was shaped by 5 years of bloody lessons learned from the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boat threat might have been fading, but it wasn't gone. Even as the Allies pushed toward victory in Europe, isolated packs of submarines continued to strike. In the North Atlantic, as Wisconsin conducted shakedown trials and convoy escort exercises, she entered a war zone haunted by invisible enemies. For the men aboard her, this was more than training. It was survival in the last days of a long, bitter maritime struggle. By late 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing on all fronts. But beneath the waves, Germany was still fighting with quiet desperation. The once feared U-boot had dwindled, yet new technology offered a final, deadly hope. The Type XXI and Type XXII Electroboot, revolutionary submarines designed to reverse Germany's fortunes at sea. Unlike their predecessors, these new U-boats were faster underwater than on the surface, capable of remaining submerged for days thanks to advanced batteries. Their sleek hulls and snorkel systems made them nearly invisible to radar and aircraft. On paper, they could have rewritten the Atlantic War, but they arrived too late. By the time production began in earnest, Allied bombers had destroyed much of Germany's shipyards and supply lines. Only a handful of the new subs ever reached combat before the war's end. Still, Donitz's remaining captains fought with grim resolve. They launched desperate missions into the North Atlantic, attacking Allied shipping lanes and task forces in hopes of disrupting supply lines to the invasion of Europe. Many of these missions were suicidal, yet the Kriegsmarine persisted, driven by a mix of duty, fatalism, and vengeance. For the US Navy, complacency was not an option. Even a single torpedo could cripple a capital ship. Battleships like Wisconsin were not designed for submarine combat. Their armor could resist shells and bombs, but not the explosive punch of a well-placed torpedo. That vulnerability made constant vigilance essential. By 1944, Allied anti-submarine warfare had become a science. Ships carried advanced sonar systems, radio countermeasures, and aerial support from escort carriers. Destroyers and destroyer escorts formed protective screens around high-value vessels. Aircraft equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors patrolled vast stretches of ocean, while improved depth charges and hedgehog projectors delivered devastating underwater attacks. The Wisconsin operated within this formidable network of defense. Her own sonar suites were primitive compared to smaller escorts, but she carried specialized crews trained to read faint echoes and identify threats beneath the waves. Every exercise simulated real combat, from false contacts to torpedo evasion maneuvers. In the North Atlantic's bitter winter, visibility was often near zero. Fog, sleet, and heavy seas masked the movement of friend and foe alike. It was in these conditions that isolated U-boats often slipped past destroyer screens, surfacing briefly to recharge before diving again into the blackness. For a ship like Wisconsin, sailing between convoys and coastal patrol sectors, danger could appear without warning. The U-boat captains knew the risks but sought glory in defiance. A battleship, a target like Wisconsin, was the ultimate prize. The sinking of such a vessel would have sent shockwaves through Allied morale. Intelligence intercepts suggested that several U-boats had been ordered to target large American warships off the eastern seaboard, believing they could deliver a symbolic blow against the US Navy. But the Americans had learned too much. The hunter was being hunted. Escort groups equipped with radar-fitted Avengers and destroyers armed with sonar tracked enemy transmissions relentlessly. Every radio message, every periscope sighting was met with immediate countermeasures. In this late-war theater of shadows, Wisconsin represented a new era of naval might, the surface warship that refused to be intimidated by the silent killers below. She carried within her the confidence of a navy that had endured years of submarine terror and emerged stronger. The encounter that awaited her would not be one of panic or surprise, but of readiness, precision, and sheer firepower. The U-boats were still dangerous, still capable of striking without warning, but for the first time in years, the balance had shifted. The fog of the North Atlantic still hid predators, but now, the prey was ready to strike back. And as sonar pings echoed once again through the steel corridors of the Wisconsin, the stage was set for a duel that would test both nerve and machine, a confrontation between the fadding power of the deep and the iron resolve of the surface fleet. Every sailor aboard the Wisconsin knew that the ocean could turn hostile in seconds. It wasn't the roar of enemy aircraft or the thunder of surface guns that haunted them, it was the silence, the idea that beneath them in the blackness something could be listening, something unseen, waiting. The human fear of submarines was ancient and instinctive. A torpedo didn't warn or announce itself. There was no flash, no incoming sound, just a sudden jolt, a shudder through the hull, and then chaos. Men who had served on earlier convoys spoke of ships breaking in half, of explosions that sent oil and fire across the water. It wasn't just destruction, it was the feeling of helplessness. On the Wisconsin, officers drilled relentlessly to banish that fear with discipline. The sonar operators, known as ping men, were the ship's first line of defense. Their headphones became lifelines, translating faint echoes into survival. A wrong call could mean disaster. They learned to distinguish whales from wreckage, friendly escorts from U-boats stalking in the thermocline layers where sonar signals bent and broke. In the engine rooms, the noise of turbines and generators made concentration difficult. Every vibration, every hum could interfere with detection. Orders were often given to reduce speed and fall silent, an entire battleship, motionless and listening, its crew frozen in suspense. For the young sailors, these moments were unbearable. Minutes stretched into hours as the Atlantic pressed around them like a living thing. The Wisconsin was an engineering marvel, but her power meant little against an enemy she couldn't see. Her massive guns, capable of leveling islands, were useless against a steel tube hundreds of feet below. The crew understood this contrast well. Their strength was intimidation. The submarine's strength was invisibility. It was a duel of opposites, brute force against stealth, daylight against darkness. In the mess halls, men spoke quietly of rumors, ships that vanished without distress calls, destroyers sunk in seconds. Yet they also knew that the tide of war had shifted. By 1944, the U-boat crews were no longer the hunters they had been in 1940. The Allies had turned the ocean into a battlefield of sensors and countermeasures. Still, fear never truly left. Even veterans of the Atlantic run admitted that every sonar contact set their hearts racing. For those aboard the Wisconsin, it wasn't courage that kept them calm, it was trust. Trust in their officers, their training, and the steel beneath their feet. Daily drills simulated everything: surprise torpedo alerts, false sonar contacts, emergency turns, and depth charge coordination with escort ships. Each man had to react without hesitation. Panic was the enemy now. A single mistake could expose the entire formation. When the order came to prepare for submarine contact, the Wisconsin became something alive, a machine of men and metal operating in perfect rhythm. Alarms blared, watertight doors sealed, and the massive ship leaned into tight, evasive maneuvers that defied her size. Destroyers around her moved like guard dogs, dropping patterns of depth charges that thundered through the ocean. Every detonation rolled through Wisconsin's decks, a deep bass that rattled the bones. The men listened for the sound that followed the muffled, distant crack of a submarine's hull imploding under pressure. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't, and when silence returned, no one cheered. They simply waited for the next ping. For the crew, the U-boats weren't just enemies, they were phantoms, reminders that war could reach from below as easily as above. Every shadow, every flicker on the sonar screen carried that quiet, ever-present question: is it them? And as the Atlantic kept its secrets, the Wisconsin's crew kept watch, learning that survival wasn't about fearlessness, it was about mastering the fear itself. Technology had always defined naval warfare, and by 1944, it was the silent war of machines that decided who lived and who sank. For every man listening through sonar headphones aboard Wisconsin, there were engineers and scientists behind the scenes pushing the limits of detection. Radar had transformed the surface war. It could spot an aircraft 100 miles away or catch the faint blip of a periscope slicing through rough seas. But below the surface, radar was blind. The battle beneath still belonged to sonar, the art of sound in the dark. The US Navy had refined this art through trial and tragedy. Early sonar sets, like the QC and later the QGB, sent pings that revealed direction but not distance. By 1944, newer models could estimate both, allowing ships to track submerged targets with remarkable precision. Operators worked in shifts, ears pressed to static, trained to hear patterns no machine could interpret alone. Yet sonar was only as good as the coordination it served. The Wisconsin operated as part of a layered defense system. Destroyers and escort vessels formed the outer ring, their agile hulls sweeping wide arcs, searching for contact. Inside that circle, Wisconsin and her fellow heavy ships sailed with calculated precision, protected but never entirely safe. Above them, aircraft filled the gap between technology and instinct. Grumman Avengers, equipped with radar and sonarbys, patrolled in sweeping patterns. Their crews dropped depth charges or called in naval forces when a periscope glinted in the sun. It was total warfare across 3 dimensions: sky, surface, and sea. As these systems evolved, so too did doctrine. The US Navy understood that speed and communication were the real weapons. Every sonar contact triggered a cascade of responses: coded radio reports, maneuver orders, and coordinated attack patterns. The goal wasn't just to kill the submarine, but to deny it any chance to strike. For Wisconsin, whose design came from an earlier vision of naval supremacy, adaptation was key. Her massive firepower had to coexist with the precision demands of anti-submarine defense. Commanders learned to balance aggression with caution, to hold position when sonar sweeps were underway, to maneuver only when safe corridors were confirmed. The technological race was relentless. The Germans countered with snorkels that allowed submarines to recharge batteries while submerged, and new coatings that absorbed sonar pings. but the Allies answered with stronger radar, better magnetic detection, and depth charges set to explode at greater depths. Every improvement came at a cost: months of study, lives lost testing prototypes, and sleepless nights for the men who depended on them. By late 1944, the advantage was clear. The U-boats were still deadly, but they were no longer ghosts. Each contact brought a swarm of destroyers, aircraft, and warships bearing down like a storm. What had once been a war of surprise had become a war of endurance. And in that transformation lay the true power of Wisconsin, not in her guns or armor, but in the network that surrounded her, a web of human and mechanical vigilance that made the ocean smaller and safer for Allied ships. The hunters of the deep still prowled, but their time was ending. And soon, one of them would learn that lesson the hard way. It was the winter of 1944, and the North Atlantic was a grave, restless thing. The Wisconsin steamed eastward in formation with a small escort screen, destroyers fanning out on her flanks, a carrier task unit several miles distant. The weather was brutal. Wind screamed across the decks, visibility near zero. Icy waves crashed against the hull, spraying the men with salt and sleet. The sea had turned into a vast grey wilderness. Then, just after 200 hours, the call came. Contact, bearing 083, range 3,000 yards, moving fast. The voice over the intercom was strained, trembling with restrained urgency. Sonar had picked up a faint echo deep and fast, moving toward the formation. The men in the Combat Information Center froze for half a heartbeat. Then came motion, rapid, practiced, precise. Sound general quarters. Klaxons blared through Wisconsin's steel corridors. Red lights flashed across the bridge. Boots thundered on metal decks as sailors raced to battle stations. In the sonar room, the operators focused on the echo, calling out updates every few seconds. The bearing was closing. The contact wasn't just a phantom, it was real. Deep below, invisible and silent, a German U-boat crept closer, a Type IXC, operating far from its base on a desperate final patrol. Its commander, Kapitänleutnant Ernst Walther, had been ordered to strike any major Allied capital ship he could find. For days he had stalked distant radar contacts, always too far to attack. But now, through the grey murk, he had found one, a giant. In his control room, red lights flickered. The crew worked in silence. The boat was running shallow, periscope depth, the commander scanning the surface through the lens. What he saw was daunting, the vast silhouette of an Iowa-class battleship, black against the dim horizon. A target of prestige, a strike that could echo across the Atlantic. He steadied himself, lows. 4 torpedoes left the tubes in succession. Their compressed air hissed through the hull, bubbles rising through the dark. The fish streaked toward the surface, armed and eager, the sea swallowing their sound. On the Wisconsin's bridge, radar picked up faint anomalies, moving fast low, cutting across the bow. Within seconds, the cry rang out, torpedoes in the water. The ship began a hard turn to starboard, her massive hull groaning under the strain. Engines roared at flank speed. The destroyer Charles S. Sperry broke formation, racing ahead, sonar pulsing, depth charges primed. The seconds crawled. The men on deck braced for impact, but the torpedoes passed wide, detonating harmlessly in the distance, columns of white water rising behind the stern. The ocean erupted with flashes and thunder, but Wisconsin remained untouched. There was no time for relief. The enemy was still out there. Return bearing 083, ordered the officer of the deck. Signal destroyers, attack pattern Delta. The escort ships surged forward. The Sperry and Hank crisscrossed the sonar contact zone, dropping depth charges in rhythmic bursts. Each explosion sent a deep vibration through the water, shaking even Wisconsin's reinforced hull. In the sonar room, operators tracked the fading echo as the U-boat dove deeper, desperate to escape. But the destroyers were relentless. The charges fell closer, tighter, their detonations forming an underwater thunderstorm. A muffled, distant crack rolled through the ocean, then silence. On the Wisconsin, the crew waited. Sonar pulses rippled through the still water, searching for movement. Nothing, just static and the endless heartbeat of the Atlantic. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the captain exhaled. Hold position, maintain search pattern. The attack had failed, but the hunter was still near. Beneath the waves, the German submarine was in chaos. The pressure hull groaned as the U-boat plunged below 600 feet, deeper than she'd ever dared before. Gauges rattled. Bolts creaked, condensation dripped from every surface. The crew whispered prayers in the dim red light. One more near miss could crush them like a tin can. Kapitänleutnant Walther knew the odds. His torpedoes had missed, his position was exposed, and the enemy above was methodical. The American destroyers weren't guessing, they were calculating, coordinating through sonar, triangulating every move he made. He gave the order to rise slightly, to level out and prepare for another attack run, but as the U-boat surfaced just enough to extend her periscope, light flickered above, search beams sweeping the fog. The massive silhouette of the Wisconsin loomed, framed by the glow of escort flares and tracer fire streaking across the night sky. Then came the counterstrike. Main batteries stand by, the order rang out across Wisconsin's bridge. Though her 16-inch guns were designed for surface combat, the secondary batteries, the 5-inch dual-purpose guns, were already tracking. Radar picked up a faint periscope wake. Within seconds, they opened fire. The ocean lit up in flashes of light and concussive blasts. Shells exploded around the periscope's last known position, the water erupting in white plumes. The U-boat rocked violently as fragments peppered her conning tower. "Dive, dive," Walther shouted. The klaxon blared and the submarine plunged once more into darkness. But above, the destroyers were waiting. They dropped another full spread, dozens of depth charges tumbling into the sea. The water convulsed as the explosions overlapped, forming a single, rolling roar that shook the very seabed. Inside the Wisconsin, men steadied themselves as the ship's massive hull shuddered with each blast. In the engine rooms, steam hissed from valves. On deck, lookouts strained through binoculars, watching the sea boil with foam. At last, the water grew still. Only a slick of oil and fragments floated to the surface, a sure sign of damage below. The captain of the Sperry reported a probable kill. The crew of Wisconsin listened in silence, the tension giving way to weary relief. They had survived the attack, and more than that, they had turned it back. The battle was short, brutal, and unseen, but its meaning was vast. The U-boat, once the terror of the Atlantic, had met a ship it could not touch. The Wisconsin's power wasn't just in her guns, it was in the coordination, the discipline, and the technology that had evolved through years of sacrifice. As dawn broke over the Atlantic, the fog began to lift. The sea, once alive with echoes and violence, lay calm again. The sun caught the steel flanks of the Wisconsin, gleaming with a cold, quiet strength. Somewhere below, the remains of the U-boat sank into darkness, another name to be lost in the Atlantic's ledger of the fallen. For the men aboard the Wisconsin, it was a reminder. The war was far from over, but the ocean's balance of power had changed forever. From that day forward, the Wisconsin sailed not as prey, but as proof that the hunters of the deep had finally met their match. The Atlantic was calm again, eerily so. The night that had begun with alarms, explosions, and sonar echoes now ended in a silence heavy with realization. The Wisconsin's crew moved through the corridors with a new weight in their steps, a blend of exhaustion, pride, and disbelief. They had faced a predator that once ruled the depths and survived. More than that, they had won. For decades, the U-boat had symbolized unseen terror. In the early years of the war, entire convoys had vanished beneath the waves. Merchant sailors feared the sudden whistle of torpedoes in the dark, the violent tremor of steel ripping apart. But by late 1944, the tide had turned. Technology, coordination, and sheer persistence had shifted the balance. The Wisconsin's encounter wasn't just another naval skirmish, it was the echo of a dying menace. When the reports came in, contact lost, oil slick confirmed, no further threat detected, a strange quiet settled over the ship. No one cheered, the men simply exhaled. They knew what it meant, another U-boat gone, another link in the chain of German undersea power broken. Captain John S. Jack Thatch, standing on the bridge, stared out over the pale horizon. His words were brief, but they carried through the cold air. "Gentlemen, the Atlantic belongs to us again." That statement, though understated, summed up a turning point. Within months, Allied command would declare the U-boat threat effectively neutralized. The great wolf packs that once prowled the ocean lanes were scattered, hunted, and sinking faster than Germany could replace them. For every U-boat still lurking beneath the waves, there were now dozens of destroyers, aircraft, and radar screens waiting above. For the crew of the Wisconsin, the encounter became a marker in time, the moment they felt the balance shift from fear to dominance. Yet the war didn't stop for reflection. Orders soon came through. The Wisconsin would join the Pacific Fleet. The Atlantic was secure, the fight was moving west. By early 1945, the ship steamed through the Panama Canal, her massive hull dwarfing the locks. She emerged into new waters, blue, sunlit, and filled with the promise of the Pacific Campaign. Ahead lay Okinawa, Tokyo, and the final chapters of the conflict. The men spoke often about that night in the North Atlantic, but less as a boast and more as a reminder that they had looked into the dark and found it blinking first. Operationally, the incident changed little in the grand scheme of strategy, but psychologically, it was everything. It reinforced faith in Allied doctrine, the belief that superior coordination, radar, and combined arms could overcome even the most elusive enemy. It also served as proof to the fleet's younger sailors that the ocean's ghosts could blade. In war rooms back home, the event was noted as a successful engagement with submerged enemy forces. No medals, no headlines, just a brief entry in the log of the Wisconsin's service record. But to those who had heard the sonar ping, seen the red lights flash, and felt the tremor of depth charges, it was far more than ink on paper. The Atlantic had been conquered, and the Wisconsin was already steaming toward the next horizon. After the war, time began to peel back the layers of secrecy that had cloaked so many naval encounters. In 1947, a declassified report from the Office of Naval Intelligence confirmed what the crew had long suspected. The submarine they had engaged was the U-873, a Type IXC that never returned to base. Intercepted transmissions suggested it had been operating independently, seeking high-value targets among Allied capital ships. The Navy's post-war analysts concluded it was likely destroyed by combined surface action and depth charge detonation, marking it as one of the final Atlantic kills before Germany's surrender. For the men of the Wisconsin, the report came as validation. Many of them were civilians again by then, scattered across small towns and quiet coasts, trying to rebuild lives after years at sea. When the Navy sent them transcripts of their after-action reports, some kept them tucked away in drawers, mementos of a night that had changed them. Chief Sonarman Leo Patterson, whose steady hands had first picked up the faint echo that night, later said in an interview, "You never forget that sound, the first ping that means something's out there, watching. But you also never forget the silence afterward. That's how you know you lived through it." As the years passed, technology moved on. Sonar grew sharper, radar more powerful, submarines faster and quieter. Yet the Wisconsin's encounter remained a study case in naval academies, a textbook demonstration of discipline under pressure and the effectiveness of coordinated anti-submarine warfare in late World War II. Historians looking back called it symbolic, the twilight of one era and the dawn of another. Battleships, once the undisputed rulers of the sea, had faced their invisible challengers and survived, but barely. Soon, aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines would redefine naval power entirely. The Wisconsin herself would return decades later during the Korean War and again in Operation Desert Storm, her 16-inch guns firing across generations, a living monument to a vanished style of warfare. By the time she was decommissioned for the final time, veterans of her Atlantic days were old men, their stories half-remembered, their photographs fading. Yet among those stories, the night they faced the U-boat remained the one most often told. It was not a tale of glory, but of endurance, of fear met with resolve, of men who had peered into a dark ocean and proven that even the unseen could be overcome. And when visitors now walk the decks of the museum ship USS Wisconsin, they often pause near the plaque commemorating her World War II service. The inscription is simple, understated, much like the men who served aboard her. In the cold Atlantic, she met the enemy unseen and sailed on.